In a spirit of prayer and meditation, after our spoken words and a time of silence, we will sing together Spirit of Life, which is hymn number 123. It's also in your order of service. We'll sing it first in English and then in Spanish. Our prayer this morning is by a friend of mine who I went to seminary with, Reverend Robin Tanner. It's called A Blessing for Risk Takers and Failures. Today we share in a blessing for losers, risk takers, all failures far and wide. Blessed are they who fall in the mud, who jump with gusto and rip the pants, who skin the elbows and bruise the ego. For they shall know the sweetness of risk. Blessed are they who make giant mistakes, whose intentions are good but impact has injured, who know the hot sense of regret and ask for mercy. For their hearts will know the gift of forgiveness. Blessed are they who have seen a D or an F or C or any letter less than perfect, who are painfully familiar with the red pen and the labels as less than. For they know the wisdom in the imperfect. Blessed are they who try again, who dust off, who wash up, who extend the wish for peace, who return to sites of failure, who are dogged in their pursuit, for they will discover the secret to dreams. Blessed are they who refuse to listen to the naysayers, for their hearts will be houses for hope. Blessed are they who see beyond the surface of another, for they will be able to delight in the gift of compassion. Blessed are they who stop running the race to help a fellow traveler, who pick up the fallen, who stop for injured life. For they shall know the kindness of strangers. Blessed are they who wildly, boldly abandon winning, for they shall know the path of justice. Amen. Is Passover by Reverend Kathleen McTeague. When the escape from Egypt was certain, when the last furious wave had closed over their enemies' heads and the dangerous waters lay smooth again, when the Israelites could finally turn toward the future without fear that the past would snatch them back, what did they see before them? Not the promised land flowing with milk and honey, but the wide and terrifying wilderness that would claim them for 40 long, hard years of wandering. They were not carried along on a surge of vindicated faith, but stumbled forward with paralyzing doubts. And instead of enjoying sweet unity after all they'd been through, they were torn by bickering and division. They walked into relentless uncertainty and discomfort and fell asleep on the hard ground to wake feeling ashamed for dreaming of the easier life of slavery they had left behind. Our own stories will never be quite so dramatic, yet each of us knows a little about what it means to be lost in the wilderness. We know the awful disappointment, akin to despair, of being suddenly pathless and alone when we'd expected to stride confidently straight into the promised land. We know how it feels to take a leap of faith toward some place we want to be in love or relationship, in work or school or location, only to find that nothing turns out the way we'd hoped and expected. The familiar has been left behind, but what we yearn for has not yet come into view. And there we are, lost in the desert. We have no way to know how long our wandering will last. These passages through the land of in-between are scary and uncomfortable. And the desert is a place we would rather barrel through as quickly as possible toward the welcoming ground of our destination. But our time in the desert is a passage of the heart, not a physical journey of the body, and it's not in our power to speed it up. Our inner deserts have something to offer us too. It's hard to fight the impulse to get out of the place of passage as quickly as possible. But each day we spend there, no matter how uncomfortable, is a precious day of our lives. What strange gifts might it offer to us if we can calm ourselves enough to look? After 40 years in the desert, the Israelites in the ancient myth finally reached its end. They touched life-giving waters again and waded into the Jordan, amazed and glad. Maybe they knew, even in that moment of deep relief and readiness, that the desert wasn't accidental, that it had opened and cleansed them in some necessary way. Maybe they understood how the wilderness had sharpened their awareness and softened their hearts, so they could at long last receive not just the gifts of the promised land, but the gifts of the desert that had brought them there. Now is the time in our service. It is Palm Sunday in the Christian tradition. It's the day that Christians celebrate the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem the week before his death. This week is also Passover in the Jewish tradition. The Jewish people celebrate Passover as a commemoration of their liberation by God from slavery in Egypt and their freedom as a nation under the leadership of Moses. As Unitarian Universalists, we draw on both traditions and often tell these ancient stories in the spring of the year. Here's a recap of each. First, let's go back to about 1300 BCE for the story of Passover, told in the book of Exodus in the Hebrew Bible. The story is usually told as part of a ritual meal called a Seder, and I hope that some of you will be joining me on Tuesday night for Am Hayam's Community Passover Seder in Orleans. In the narrative of the Exodus, the Bible tells that God helped the children of Israel escape from their slavery in Egypt by inflicting 10 plagues upon the ancient Egyptians before the Pharaoh would release his Israelite slaves. The first is water turning to blood. The fish died in the rivers and lakes, and for a whole week man and beast suffered horrible thirst. Yet Pharaoh would not give in. Next came frogs. They covered every inch of land and entered the houses and bedrooms. One frog is cute, right? Thousands are super creepy. Then bugs, wild animals, pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, and darkness. For several days, all of Egypt was enveloped in a thick and impenetrable veil of darkness, which extinguished all lights kindled. The 10th and worst of the plagues was the death of the Egyptian firstborn children. The Israelites were instructed to mark the doorposts of their homes with the blood of a slaughtered spring lamb. And upon seeing this, the Spirit of the Lord knew to pass over the firstborn in those homes. Hence the English name of the holiday, Passover. When the Pharaoh finally agreed to free the Israelites to stop the plagues, it is said that the Jews left in such a hurry that they could not wait for their bread dough to rise. In commemoration for the duration of Passover, no leavened bread is eaten. The next part of the story you heard about in this morning's reading, 40 years in the wilderness. Remember, it was not the freed slaves who entered into the promised land. It was their grandchildren. And now let's go forward 1,000+ years to the last days of Jesus' life for the story of Holy Week. Holy Week begins with Palm Sunday, which I already said remembers the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. This is one of the few events described in all 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in the New Testament. As described in the accounts, Jesus' entry into Jerusalem was noted by the crowds present who shouted praises and waved palm branches. That's where we get the tradition of the palms. And I want to thank St. Peter's Catholic Church for providing us with our palms today, and Kathleen. Palm Sunday is generally celebratory, but as we move into the rest of the week, the Christian story becomes more of a wilderness story. On Monday comes the anointing of Jesus at Bethany. Other biblical events which may have occurred on this day include Jesus cursing the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple, Jesus throwing out the money changers from this sacred space. The powers that be can't believe his audacity. Who does he think he is? On Tuesday, the Gospel of John says that Jesus predicts his own death. Imagine how heavy his heart must be moving through the rest of this story with that shadow over him. On Wednesday, Judas, one of Jesus' closest friends and disciples, arranges with the high priests to betray Jesus for money. This story is already devastating. Jesus is a radical justice maker, and he knows that he has a lot of enemies, but it's not the government or the skeptical strangers that betray him. It's his ally. Thursday brings the Last Supper, where Jesus dines for the last time with his 12 apostles and lays out the model for sharing bread and wine and remembering him. Remember that Jesus shares this last meal with all his disciples, even Judas, who has betrayed him, and Peter, who will soon deny even knowing him. When Jesus is arrested, Peter follows at a distance but does not defend him. He can see it's too late for Jesus, so he denies him and saves himself. Good Friday commemorates the crucifixion of Jesus and his subsequent death. And of course, Easter Sunday is a celebration of the rise of Jesus from the tomb through the resurrection. The women go to the tomb to mourn and perform their last death rituals and find it empty. What a roller coaster of emotions Holy Week is. Since we don't usually observe those midweek commemorations, we often feel only the joy of Palm Sunday and the joy of Easter. But so much happens in between. I was going to preach today on whose stories are these, and wrestle with the question of who gets to tell the stories of Passover and Holy Week. Should churches host seders? Does the story of the liberation of the Israelites belong only to those who are Jewish? Is there a place for Holy Week in a UU congregation where many people do not identify as Christian? Is there value in devoting a Sunday to a story we may be skeptical of? Who gets to say what is true and what truth means? But you know what? As I spent time with both the Passover and Palm Sunday stories this week, those didn't seem to be the pertinent questions to be asking anymore. You see, this week, those ancient stories were in conversation for me with what was going on in this current time. Of course, that is by design. There is the heartbreaking world news, of course, the distress over our bombing of Syria and our continued unwillingness to accept refugees. There's the wrestling with the institution of government and the inability of Democrats and Republicans to work together meaningfully. And there has also been some heartbreaking news about the other big institution in my life, the Unitarian Universalist Association. Many of you heard that our UUA president, Reverend Peter Morales, resigned last week. This morning, I let you know that 2 other people have resigned from their top positions of Chief Operating Officer and Director of Congregational Life. This comes on the heels of a painful realization that our UUA hiring practices have routinely preferenced white people for the top positions, and that our progress in hiring more people of color has mostly been for the lowest paying jobs or in volunteer positions. This conversation has been a painful one and has caused a multitude of responses. Reverend Morales, who was our president before his resignation, is Latino, and I think he prided himself on his diversity initiatives within our denomination. So to get criticism for sustaining a culture of white supremacy must have been a difficult thing for him to hear. He responded poorly, and I don't really know the story about the other 2 resignations, but it seems like these painful leave takings are at least making room for the discussion of what we value and how we show it when it comes to equality, anti-racism, and multiculturalism. It's making room for a conversation that we've needed to have about how racism can live deeply within systems and institutions, even as individuals work so passionately for justice, individually and collectively. On the heels of this news came other heartbreaking news that a UU minister in Oklahoma was arrested last week on federal child pornography charges. All those who he ministered to, his family and friends, his colleagues, we are all shocked and sickened by this news, even those of us who don't know him. It has felt very heavy this week to be a Unitarian Universalist, to be navigating all the feelings, to be taking part in the dark night of the soul required to face these things head on and to learn from them rather than simply despair. I have to tell you that it was tempting not to loop you into these stories at all, knowing that our connection to the Unitarian Universalist Association and this congregation do not often reach beyond these 4 walls. Maybe you would never hear of them, and I could save you from some of that wrestling that I have been doing. But that was not the right thing to do, and I only entertained the idea briefly. It's not right for several reasons, one of which is that it would have left me alone in my wrestling instead of in community. And the other is that if I include you in the problems of our denomination, then that opens the possibility of you all helping to be part of the solution and the healing and the learning that needs to be done, especially at this point in time. As a recent letter from the Leadership Council so eloquently said, you and your best values are also the UUA. And you know what? It helped me this week to be reading the stories of Holy Week and Passover, because they also are stories of brokenness, of doubt, of betrayals, of wilderness. So in a time when we may feel so tempted to turn a blind eye to the failings of our faith and our leaders and the complex realities of living in community, we are being offered these two ancient stories that don't turn away from the roller coaster of faith and community. Instead, they encompass the highs and the lows which are at the heart of the Christian and Jewish stories. Here I was ready to question who owns these stories, when I realized that it doesn't matter whose stories these are. It matters what we can all learn from them. We can learn that the faithful thing to do is to be honest about our full story, to tell our full story, to pass on our full story, not bury the hard parts. We can say, I belong to a denomination that is wrestling with race right now. We have a long history of racial justice work, and we are still working on it now. Because although we were in Selma, we didn't figure it all out back then or in the 50 years since. And we still have a long way to go. And one step toward peace, justice, and equity for all is to say that out loud and to own it. We can say, one of the leaders in our denomination did something horrible involving the exploitation of children. And we can't understand why, and we are heartsick about it, and we are ashamed, but we're not going to hush it up or sweep it under the rug, because we know that that will cause more injury, and we commit to being open about it so that we don't add secrecy to the list of our failures. And we can say, all this news is hard for me to hear, part because I'm disappointed in so many institutions right now, and also because it's bringing up feelings about my own personal shortcomings, which is not easy to sit with. You know, I have a confession. I spend quite a lot of time on Facebook. And I will defend that practice adamantly because I get a lot of good ideas on there. But I also see that sometimes I get discouraged and kind of depressed even looking at Facebook, because I see all those blissfully happy people and perfect families and tons of parties that I wasn't invited to and trips that I didn't take and vacations that I'll never be able to afford. Facebook is great, but it asks us to compare our lives to the online lives of others, and the comparisons are unfair. Because our Facebook stories are curated to leave out the bad parts. We don't post the pictures that have double chins in them. We post the good pictures, the ones that show our best side. We don't wax poetic about the fight we just had with our partner or coworker. We tell the good stories, the funny ones, the ones that show our best side. We don't post our self-doubts about parenting decisions or feelings of isolation or low self-esteem. We post our accomplishments. So viewing the world through Facebook can give you a false sense of what people's lives are like. And if you are constantly comparing your own life to what you see on there, or what you see in the magazines or on TV, you are going to end up feeling really bad about yourself. The truth is that life is messy, religion is messy, institutions are messy, politics are messy, justice work is messy. The foundational stories of Christianity and Judaism are messy. Remember what Kathleen McTeague said in our opening reading? When the escape from Egypt was certain, when that last furious wave had closed over their enemies' heads and the dangerous waters lay smooth again, what did they see before them? Not the promised land flowing with milk and honey, but the wide and terrifying wilderness that would claim them for 40 long, hard years of wandering. They were not carried along on a surge of vindicated faith, but stumbled forward with paralyzing doubts. And instead of enjoying sweet unity after all they'd been through, they were torn by bickering and division. Peter Fleck, who is sort of one of the patron saints of this meeting house, once wrote, "We must have the courage to be a failure. From this courage, from this willingness to let go what the world cherishes most, stems the strength of the Spirit. This is the mystery that is embedded in all great religions," he says, "but in none so clearly, so unequivocally as in Christianity. The story of Jesus' life," he says, "was the story of a gigantic failure. A failure of such dimensions that the Western world, spiritually speaking, is still living by its grace. The grace by which the poor in spirit are blessed, the mourners are comforted, and the meek shall inherit the earth." These stories we retell every year, these key religious stories, these are not Facebook stories. They are stories of failure and struggle and betrayal and perseverance and death and rebirth and hope. All of that in one big, messy, thousands of years old story of living messy life. And telling these messy stories, not leaving the hard parts out, it's not a depressing endeavor. It's a deeply hopeful one, because it's our full stories that give us faith. Amen, and blessed be.